Imagine throwing a stone inside Vaseline or a bowl of Vaseline. It won't really go down, that if at all, okay? But imagine throwing that same stone inside a bowl of water. It will quickly go down. Now, let's talk about the ovarian cycle. We haven't talked about the uterine cycle, that's the changes that happen in the uterus. Now, let's look at the ovarian cycle. That is what happens in the ovary. Remember again that I said these cycles are not independent of each other. Okay, they are not mutually exclusive. They happen simultaneously. As things are happening in the ovary, things are happening in the uterus. Okay, but I want you to understand it. That's why I had to do one before the other. Now, the ovarian cycle has 3 phases. The first is the follicular phase, follicular phase. The second is the ovulation phase. That's where you ovulate. And the third is the luteal phase. Now, this follicular phase is when the follicles in the ovary are growing. Now, these ovaries have eggs, okay? And these eggs are inside follicles, all right? So, all of these round things you're seeing, this one I'm depicting here, okay? So all of these round things in this ovary, this is me bringing the picture of the ovary down here. So this is the ovary. All these round things are the ovarian follicles. So the menstrual cycle generally is under the influence of hormones, okay? So these various follicles in the ovary are under the influence of hormones to grow, and they are growing with one aim, that the biggest of them is the one that will ovulate, is the one that will break to release an egg for that month, okay, that is going to possibly be a baby. Now, the biggest follicle is called the Graafian follicle. Graafian follicle, the biggest one, continues to grow. It grows and it outgrows the other under the influence of hormones, and it is the one that has chance of being ovulated. 2 days before ovulation, there are 2 major hormones that begin to spike under the influence of another hormone called estrogen. I don't want to confuse you, but there is usually a surge of FSH, that is follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone. Now, these are the 2 hormones, and these hormones begin to surge. They go high under the influence of another hormone called estrogen. Now, this is estrogen here. Estrogen or estrogen. Okay? So basically, it's just British American. Now, this FSH and luteinizing hormone, they become very high, especially luteinizing hormone. And this is what leads to ovulation. Do you understand? So when this egg is now released from the follicle, let me do it like this. This follicle begins to move, comes closer because it wants to go out, and then it breaks. It now releases the egg. Do you understand? This follicle here is the one that is here, okay, just like an eggshell. It breaks, it releases the egg yolk. Okay, I'm just giving an example. So the egg comes out and it leaves the eggshell behind. So the follicular phase now is when these various follicles are growing in order to achieve a bigger size that will give them the chance of ovulating over the other ones. Do we understand? That is basically the follicular phase, and this happens under the influence of hormones. Now, I've already explained the ovulation by virtue of explaining what happens in the ovary. So ovulation is basically when that Graafian follicle, the big egg, ruptures during ovulation around day 14, averagely for an average menstrual cycle of 28 days. Okay, so it releases an egg. That is it. Release of an egg from an ovary, that is ovulation. And that is the second phase of the ovarian cycle. Now, this ovulation phase, because of ovulation and the possibility of pregnancy, as ovulation is being prepared for or occurs in the uterus also, there are some changes that happen that leads to or supports the possibility of pregnancy. You know that the cervical mucus, that discharge that a woman usually has during her menstrual cycle generally, changes in consistency from sometimes very scanty and thick to being a bit loose, a bit creamy. At a particular stage, it becomes very thin and watery. Okay, now this ovulation phase is characterized by a unique kind of discharge, which is usually watery, thin, and stretchy. And that signifies that the woman is very fertile at that period. Most women experience that discharge about 2 days before ovulation. It doesn't really happen on the day of ovulation, gong gong. And this discharge is as such very thin and watery because it helps to ease the movement of sperm into the uterus. This is the cervix. Okay, so the discharge from the cervix at that time, that is the cervical mucus at that stage, is very thin to allow sperm easily pass through to facilitate pregnancy. That is what is unique about the ovulation phase. So the woman begins to see that watery discharge. She knows that if anything happens now, it's pregnancy. You understand? And it helps the woman to be able to know her fertile period, because that period signifies high fertility. Imagine throwing a stone inside Vaseline or a bowl of Vaseline. It won't really go down, that if at all. Okay? But imagine throwing that same stone inside a bowl of water. It will quickly go down because water is very light. It's not as viscous as Vaseline, and it will go down to its destination, which is the ground. Now, it's the same thing that happens here. This cervical mucus becomes very thin and watery so that the sperm can easily swim through, and it reduces its stress along its way. That is to enable fertilization occur. Okay, so that is unique about the ovulation phase. Now, what is the luteal phase? Luteal phase is derived from corpus luteum, and I explained that when an egg has been released, that's like this, and the fallopian tubes pick it using these finger-like structures into the fallopian tubes. Whatever remains here, that is this one here, is the eggshell, right? So this eggshell here is what we call the corpus luteum. And this corpus luteum, its function in this stage or this phase of the menstrual cycle is to begin to secrete a hormone called progesterone, which I also explained. This progesterone is what helps to prepare the endometrium for pregnancy. And because this hormone is very important, it keeps on being secreted till the baby or till that egg is fertilized and implanted. So it sustains pregnancy for a period of time. That is the function of progesterone, but I wouldn't go into that. Now, if this corpus luteum keeps on secreting that progesterone to prepare the uterus, but there is no pregnancy, there is no fertilization, and there is no pregnancy, what happens to it? It comes and dies because it cannot continue to remain there. So it changes from corpus luteum something expired, and we call that corpus albicans. Okay, so this is corpus albicans, and the body absorbs it and it goes away. That chance of pregnancy has passed, so every other thing has to go back to normal, and that is what happens. But as long as there's pregnancy, this corpus luteum continues to secrete that progesterone and then maintains pregnancy. That is what happens in the luteal phase. Okay, that is where the hormone progesterone is the highest and it helps to maintain pregnancy. Now, this follicular phase, as we know, it starts on the first day of the menstrual cycle, where the ovarian follicles begin to grow again. Another possible chance of pregnancy. So it begins to grow. It overlaps with the menstrual phase of the uterine cycle. Let me just write it here.
Again, we said we have the menstrual, we have the proliferative, and then we have the secretory. Okay, so it coincides
with the menstrual phase of the uterine cycle because because the menstrual phase, as I said, is when there's shedding. So at that phase, the ovary is also preparing new follicles for possible ovulation for another new cycle. Okay, and this menstrual phase, remember that the day one of the menstrual cycle generally is the first day the woman sees the menstrual blood, and that is it. So the ovary begins to prepare for another cycle. That is it about the phases of the menstrual cycle. So essentially, I've talked about the menstrual cycle. I've stated that the menstrual cycle is just a series of events that happen in the ovaries and in the uterus with the possibility of pregnancy. And there are two major cycles: the ovarian cycle, which happens in the ovary, uterine cycle, which happens in the uterus. The ovarian cycle has three phases: follicular phase, the ovulation phase, and the luteal phase, while the uterine cycle majorly consists of three phases: the menstrual phase, the proliferative phase, and the secretory phase. And this happens just as I've explained. So essentially, in the ovary, different eggs are being prepared for ovulation. The biggest one that has the chance of ovulation gets ovulated, it moves into the fallopian tube. If pregnancy occurs, fertilization occurs, the baby will be implanted in the womb. If pregnancy does not occur, the body has a way of absorbing it and it goes. If the pregnancy does not occur also, this wall of the uterus, which was developing to feed the baby, will now shed as menstrual blood because there is no need for it to be there. And menstrual blood flows. That is how another cycle will continue with the chance of pregnancy. If pregnancy occurs, fine. If it doesn't, again and again and again and again. So this cycle is one cycle that we all must understand how it works and all of that. So I'll be talking more about the details of certain aspects of the menstrual cycle to track fertility, no fertile days, and no safe periods. So that is it for this class. Thank you so much for learning, and if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask. Thank you so much for watching. Bye. See you in my next video.